Well, good morning to everybody all across Atlantic Canada joining us this morning. My name is Jeff, and I'm a teacher and program specialist with Brilliant Labs here in Nova Scotia.
And my name is Sarah, and I'm a lead program specialist with Brilliant Labs Nova Scotia, and we're really happy for all of you and your students to join us today.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you all for being here. So we've had one of those mornings. There's a couple things going on. I'm actually on my phone right now because there's no power at my house. So we're just rolling with the punches
Just
today. So
rolling with it, and I'm a bit laggy here, so I'll be on and off camera. But we really appreciate your patience in joining us with Brilliant Labs. Although we do a lot of techie stuff, we also know that these things happen, and that's the way it goes. Let's go, Jeff.
all right. Well, today we're going to be talking all about the cold. And to get started, I noticed about a week or so ago, my daughter was watching some videos on YouTube Kids, and she flicks through them pretty quick. But this one we stopped and we talked about for a second because it was really cool. So it was this polar bear filmed from like a drone flying overhead, and he's swimming under the water, and there's big chunks of ice that are there, and he just comes up. It's like he's just going for a casual swim, and we just started talking about how crazy that was and how cold that would be and how awful that would be for us as people. But that's everyday life for that polar bear. It's a funny thing to think about, that our bodies are so different that could literally end my life. But for him, it's just everyday life.
For sure, for sure.
So we had a couple of things that we're going to talk about today with you. So the first question we're going to consider is, why does it actually get colder in the winter here in Canada? Why do we deal with this? And then digging into that question of animals and how they survive in the winter when things get really cold. And then we'll focus a little bit more as well on how we as humans keep ourselves warm by doing some architecture. So like how we build our buildings to help ourselves keep warm.
Exactly. So what have we done over the years? As we know, our climate is changing, our temperature has changed over many, many years. And of course, we have adaptation with animals. And what do we have done as people and community society to keep up with that? So this model that we're looking at right now isn't perfect, but since the Earth spins on its own axis about 365 times per year, and this looks more like 15 rotations, sorry. But notice how the North and South Pole aren't perfectly vertical. So pointed up and down. Okay, we have a horizontal and vertical, but there's a tilt to the Earth. It's this tilt that causes the seasons for us. So right now we're in the season of winter, and then it seems like a long way off, but soon we'll have spring. And there's a big difference in what we feel, the temperature, how our environment around us reacts, and the animals, and how we build our structures. So when we look at the sun's rays that come through our atmosphere on more of an angle, like this little video that we have here, not as much heat comes through to the Earth's surface. This is felt more in our northern hemisphere. Places that are more south still keep much warmer throughout the year. This also explains why some places on Earth stay cold year-round. So right now it feels like we've been in a permanent cold for a while. It's only been a couple of days, but as we know, it can get very, very hot in Canada. And Canada is a great example because Canada can be so different from one coast to the other as far as how we experience our seasons. Even though we all experience summer at the same time of the year and winter, it can be very, very different across our beautiful country.
Yeah, I know one thing I've heard before, Sarah, about that is some people think that it's winter because we're further away from the sun. But like you were saying, that's not true. It's all about the angle of the Earth, how the Earth is actually tilted on that axis. It's not because we're further away, so it's colder. It's the way that the heat enters our atmosphere. It's pretty cool.
And that actually, and we could have a big conversation about a climate change and the greenhouse effect, but because our atmosphere is in different states around the world, it really does affect how seasonal temperature and climate has changed over the years as we have kind of changed our atmosphere. So this model, this video that we're viewing, it helps us see the seasons. Of course, we feel them and experience them differently than what we're looking at right here, but we're looking at Earth right now from the North Pole. Areas turn green in the spring and summer and white in the winter. So if you can see the areas that do not actually turn green on this video right here, that's referred to as permafrost. So like permanent frost, permanent cold. I know right now where I am on the Eastern Shore, it is cold. So can you imagine how that would be year round? So this is an area of the earth that never heats up. That's when, no matter what season it is, or time of the year, it doesn't change. It's always cold. And it's always covered in ice and snow.
So in thinking about those places that are often cold or cold all year round, in some places even, there's still a ton of creatures and communities of people that aren't just surviving there, they're thriving there. This is their community, this is where they live, this is what they're used to, and they are really good at living there. So to think about some of the animals, these might look familiar to you. You might recognize that little, the Arctic fox or the walrus. This animal still baffles me that it exists, but that's a narwhal on the right there with that really long tusk. And of course, the polar bear. And I just want to spend a little bit of time this morning talking about polar bears because they have some pretty unique ways that they help keep themselves warm. Because like we saw at the beginning, they're in and out of the water and they don't get to go inside and warm up like we do. Like I love playing outside, but I also like it when I get to go in and warm up afterwards. And they don't have that. So their body has to be able to do it itself. So Sarah, if you want to jump to the next slide for me there. So looking at this, this polar bear a little bit more close up, it has some adaptations or ways that its body has changed over time so that it's able to handle being in the cold. So, for example, one of those things is that its skin actually isn't white. A polar bear's skin is black. So if like you shaved a little section of it, it would be actually have black skin. So how that helps the bear is that when the sun hits it, black is a really absorbent to heat. So when the sun is shining, it's absorbing that heat and bringing it into its body. Something else in that picture on the left that you might notice, if you look really close, or maybe you'll have to Google this to trust me, the hairs aren't actually white. The hairs are actually transparent. They're almost like glass. They're see-through. And not just that, they're hollow. So polar bears' hairs aren't white, they're clear, and they're hollow. They're like little mini glass tubes. So what that does is it lets, again, it's kind of like my window when the sun is shining in. It just pulls that heat in and it traps the heat inside. So it brings the heat in. Those little hollow hairs keep the heat inside them and let it get right into its body. So it has all these different ways that it's keeping out the cold. And to add to this, it has a second layer of hair that actually is really oily, so that when he is in the water isn't actually touching his skin. He's actually got this protective oily layer over his body to keep the water away. So I want to go over those again because that was a lot. So he has an oily layer to keep water away. So his skin actually doesn't get very wet.
Hydrophobic.
It's got those, got those hollow, transparent hairs, which are really good at trapping heat and getting it into the body. And his skin is black so that it can absorb more of that heat energy from the sun. And then finally, underneath there, you can see it on the right, that thick yellow layer is called blubber. And it's this thick, fatty layer over his body, which again works like insulation or like a warm blanket on inside of his body to keep him warm all the time. So once all that heat comes into his body, that layer of fat locks it in so that it can hold that heat as long as possible.
And that's really amazing, Jeff, because it just makes me think about this as we're starting at the top layer. Like you mentioned, the actual strands of hair are translucent like glass. So we know that heat and light can transfer through. And then imagine when you're in the summertime and you go and you step on maybe the pavement, which is dark and black, and it absorbs the heat. And you can really tell that difference. And it really absorbs that heat, and you can feel it on your own feet. And the blubber is very much like it's an oily substance. So we know that when we cook with oil, or we use oil for many, many things, it really is something that that is so definitely transfers the heat and is pretty much ignites it in some ways. So it's amazing how all of these adaptations at the polar bear. It'd be wonderful to know how the polar bear would exist, perhaps in an area that was not so cold.
Yeah, that's a good point. With those same features, how would it do in a warmer climate?
So, but when we're talking about this, we say, what about us? So we think about where we live here compared to somewhere that's like in South America or even California or even on the west coast of Canada, say Vancouver. How do our buildings and our infrastructure differ from areas that have different climates and temperature year round? So what do we need to do here in, say, Nova Scotia versus, like I mentioned, the West Coast, as far as building our structures? Now, we do in Canada, we have a very variant climate and temperatures, but it's certainly when architects and engineers and people design things where people and animals are going to live, they have to take into account many things. So of course the weather, how that's going to change, whether we're in a tornado zone or hurricane storm, but definitely we have to think about temperature and how do we insulate things so that we are best prepared to keep in the heat and during the cold times like now, and keep cool in the warmer times. And such a great example on the East Coast here is that we do have hot summers and cold winters. So think about when you're walking around your community, your school, your home, what are the things that are used so that we can stay comfortable? So almost like taking it from if we're the polar bear, more so like the polar bear's adaptations with the skin and the fur and the colors. What do we do to be able to survive and be comfortable within where we live and where we spend our time?
Yeah. In doing some looking into the different layers that we put into the buildings that we build these days, like if someone's building a house, it's not just, wood and then they put up the wall. There are all these different layers that have different purposes for keeping that temperature comfortable for humans. And when I was doing a little research into this and preparing for this, I had the realization that the way that a polar bear keeps warm is actually really similar to the way that we build our buildings. So bear with me here. So that polar bear had
Mhm.
that oily layer to keep the water out of its body, like so that that water didn't make it cold. Well, when we build buildings, we often put in something called a vapor barrier. It's like a plastic sheet, something to keep the moisture out. So our buildings have a way to keep it out, and so do these animals that live in cold climates. That's in that first picture on the left there.
Mhm.
Um, in the middle and on the side, it's showing different kinds of insulation. So that's that thick, sometimes it's really pink or he's spraying in that purple looking stuff.
Mhm.
So that's a thick layer of insulation meant to keep out the cold, to put like a thick layer between the outside cold temperature and the inside warmer temperature. And that's just like the blubber on the polar bear.
Exactly.
Um, and the last one, we were saying that the polar bear has those see-through hairs that are good at bringing heat in, and our windows do the same thing. When we have windows in our houses that are facing the sunshine, those are great for letting heat transfer into our homes, and then all those other things lock it in. It's pretty cool how it's almost like the way we build our houses was inspired by how polar bears have been keeping warm for tens of thousands of years.
Exactly. And it reminds me of the greenhouse effect, so that with our atmosphere, we can have heat and light go in, and depending on where it's transferring to. So if it's in an area, say perhaps like a hot car or a vehicle, and we know we don't want to leave people, children, animals, or anybody in there in the summertime too long, because it has the ability to go through the windows and the glass to absorb that heat, but the heat doesn't actually leave. So it keeps heating up inside, which is really great when we do it for buildings, but we have to be really aware of what the situation is, and how in some circumstances, if we're building something that we really want to make sure that we adapt for the seasonal changes and the climate and the temperature changes, that we take that into account. And that's what we've been doing for a while now. And as our temperature and our climate changes, we have to also adapt to our architecture.
Yeah, great point.
So at Brilliant Labs here, and many educational areas and circumstances in Canada and around the world, we've been looking at the United Nations Sustainable Developmental Goals. So what does that mean? In 2015, there was a plan made essentially by the world to say, look, we need to do better. We need to make sure that we plan ahead, and we need to build a better world for everybody. So at Brilliant Labs, we've been developing projects and lesson plans and really incorporating the United Nations Sustainable Developmental Goals into our projects and challenges to help students and youth be able to participate and essentially meet these important targets. Because where we're adults, and that's great to be able to pass on information, we want to make sure that the future is prepared to be able to make changes themselves. So this is a great opportunity to connect with how each one of us, no matter how old or how young we are, we can spark action and change through our learning and how we use that, and the things that we do in our school, our home community. So we can really, whether you're 5 or you're 95, you can boldly solve real problems in the biggest and the brightest ways to improve the lives of people everywhere, not just here in Atlantic Canada, but around the world, and by sharing that and transforming the world together. So we can really play an active role in doing this. And just by having these discussions like we're having today about temperature and about how cold it is and about the animals here and on the other side of the hemisphere, then we really are getting that conversation going, and that actually moves forward to change. So like I mentioned, we discussed today about adaptations and a little bit about climate change and how animals adapt and how we've adapted with our infrastructure and building buildings so that we're comfortable. But we have to look forward and see how we can do better and help both our animals, our communities, and our environment. So, and especially today where we're talking about our polar friends, such as a polar bear and the narwhal, what can we do for our future? So just a little touch upon climate change and what we were discussing. As a result of climate change, the Arctic, where our friends, the polar bears and other animals live, is experiencing much more of an intense and rapid or quick change than any other part of the world. So that means that there's the melting of the ice that they live on, that they've adapted so long over so many years to have these great ways to live comfortably, is changing at a faster rate than they can even understand, or at least their adaptation can. Such things as like when the ice melts and the sea levels rise and the acidity or the makeup of the oceans change, it affects enormous amount of things, from like the biggest whales to the smallest tiny plankton that live in this great, wonderful area of the world. But the good thing is that Arctic warming can still be slowed, okay? And it can possibly be reversed by developing the necessary changes now. But we have to really think about this and do this now, because it's not something that we can kind of have in the back of our mind. We really want to be aware of how things are changing around the world, but in particular the Arctic, and how fast it's happening. So some of the ways that we can do this, we can reduce our carbon dioxide to a much lower level. We can reduce our greenhouse pollutants, so like things when we're burning oil or things that are fossil fuel related, methane and ozone. And we can really do a lot of things to help these animals be able to live the way that they have been living, because really they don't have a lot of cities and things that we experience here, but what we do here affects them where they live.
Yeah, so I think we'll just check in on our goals that we set at the beginning there. We were saying that we were going to figure out why it got colder. So we were talking about how the axis of the Earth was tilted.
Mm-hmm.
We focused on the polar bear for the animals, but we would love to hear if you did some research and learned about some different creatures that live in cold climates and how they adapt, because there are a ton of mammals and there's birds and there's so many different fish and creatures that have different kinds of adaptations to survive there. So if you find out anything cool, let us know. And we also looked at different structures that that architects build so that they're able to work for the people that live in those climates, especially those different kind of climates like here in Nova Scotia. When
Mhm.
you build a house, you have to be planned for the hot summers and also those freezing, like today, it's freezing cold outside,
Very,
these
very cool.
freezing winters. Yeah, there's a lot of things to consider.
Maybe there's some pointers that we can look back, look at where our polar friends are and think, wow, what could we do differently? Because we do find that the winters are getting colder and the summers are getting hotter. And as important as it is to our friends, the animals, we have to consider what we can do as well.
All right. Well, I think it's time for us to set a challenge for you.
For sure.
So your teacher might have already told you some of these little details, but we'll kind of go through it and just show you some of the things that we are planning to experiment with a little bit. And you can decide with your teacher when the best time is for you to do this little maker challenge. So this is what we've decided. So in thinking about the cold and about insulating things, we want to see if we can insulate a container of water so that you could put it in a freezer, or today in Nova Scotia, it's minus 16, which is how cold my freezer is. So you could put it outside
Yep.
and see if you can insulate it well enough to keep it from freezing for a couple hours. So if there was, I'll give kind of the initial steps, but then how you design this is totally up to you. And the more creative and unique, the better. We love to see all these the different ways that people have done it. I was suggesting a bottle of water, but I actually don't have bottles of water at my house. So I grabbed a couple, two Tupperware containers that are the same.
Yep.
So I am going to have one of these containers be what I'll call the control group. So they'll
Mhm.
both have the same amount of water. And then I will insulate one of them with my design, and I'll leave the other one with no insulation. And then I'll be able to look at it and say, well, if the one with no insulation is frozen, I wonder if my other one was able to stay thawed out. So this one with no covering at all will be able to tell me uh, how long it's been long enough, because everybody's freezers are different. So
Exactly.
it might take longer. If I say 2 hours, it might actually be 2.5 for your freezer, or
And
3.
if you put it outside, it might depend on how the sun is going throughout the day.
Yeah. So I don't know what you were thinking, Sarah, for your stuff. I was trying to mimic the polar bear a little bit. I'm still really inspired by the polar bear. So I was thinking about different layers that I could add to wrap around my container. So I'll put my water in it, I'll close it up, and then I've got some different materials that I was thinking of trying.
Yeah, so what I was thinking is that I don't have them handy, but I was thinking things that, like we mentioned, that there's a really tight insulator. Just we want to mimic essentially the now where we're going to be putting in the freezer. We don't have the sun shining, and we're not really taking into account the color of the skin of the polar bear, where it was dark and absorbs heat with the darkness. That's not really a factor here because we don't have heat. We're more so putting it in a cold environment, but something that would be tight to the actual container. And then we're looking at multiple layers, right? So we have everything
Yeah.
from paper to socks, anything that's around the house. Really, we're experimenting and we're doing a challenge now. And if it doesn't, and we want to take notes. The main thing is that what we use, how many layers, what the materials are, versus like Jeff mentioned, the control. That has nothing, and what that difference that makes. And even if you wanted to get, like, you had extra time, you want to be fun, see the difference between the layers that you add. So maybe you put on your first layer and then test it after an hour and see that, and then add another one and add another one. And how many layers can you add? How many different materials and what kind of materials? So, we have things that are soft and that are really malleable and will fit around the bottle. And then we have things that are kind of hard and like Lego is how would Lego work? Or
That would be
pasta.
fun. I could build Lego around
Always
this.
make
I
sure
could
you
totally build Lego around this. That'd be a
yeah.
nice fun shell to put around this. That'd be
Make
great.
sure you ask your parents or whomever the adult at home before you start grabbing stuff, of course. But get inventive. Think about you don't just necessarily think about the polar bear, but think about what we use in our houses and our architecture and what you see and animals. But also think about maybe you'll be the one to discover a new way to insulate or to keep that heat in when it goes into the freezer, and that water does not freeze as quickly as the one that has nothing.
Yeah. I was thinking for mine, I wanted it to have something to keep the heat that it already has. So I
Hmm.
was going to wrap mine in tin foil first. I thought that
Nice.
metallic layer might help it keep that heat inside and not let it get away. So I don't know if it's going to work yet, but I think
Well,
it's worth experimenting.
that's awesome, Jeff, because if you think about when I see people at skating rinks or, like outside doing snowshoeing or whatever, they have thermoses that are made out of metal. So aluminum
It's a
is
good
a type
point.
of metal. So we know that conductive, which means to transfer heat, or in some cases, energy. And heat is energy, but electricity, if something's conductive, it means that it transfers heat. Either it speeds up the cooling process or the heating process. So I won't get into endothermic and exothermic here, but the thing is that
Next time.
yeah, like I throw those words out there. But the thing is that transfer of energy really has to do with the material. And we did mention the oily part of the polar bear's skin and their fur, and that has a big, not just as hydrophobic, which means water fearing or keeping water off and helping with that, but it also is transparent with energy as well. So keep that in mind. So tin foil is a great way to look at that, because I know that when I look at thermoses and things that are both meant to keep things cold and in the summer or the hot months and keep things warm in the winter, they usually involve things like metal.
Yeah. So we would love to see, like I say, different materials that you try, different combinations of materials that you can try, and see if you can get that water to stay thawed out, not frozen, for as long as you can. Can you get 2 hours out of it? Can you insulate it for 4 or 5 hours? It would be I look forward to hearing what people come
Yeah,
up with.
tell us what you did. Again, like make sure that you have an adult or somebody in the room to help you decide what to use. But we would love if you can do that experiment and maybe even get some time. Like, so what's the difference between if you use this material versus that? Again, we have one bottle that is not, or one container that is not manipulated, or it doesn't have anything around it to see how long it takes for an average bottle of water or container in the freezer to freeze. And you could just take that and take that time. And then from there, you could take the other one and just keep changing things and see the difference and how long it stays in that liquid state of matter versus freezing into that solid.
Absolutely. All right. Well, on that, we will leave you to the making. Have a fantastic day. Keep warm, and we hope to see you soon. Thanks so
Thanks
much
so
for
much for
coming.
joining us. Stay warm and keep cool and stay brilliant.
Ooh, both.
Bye.
Bye, everybody.